You're listening to this radio show. Perhaps you watched some of the Sunday morning talk shows earlier today, or you're going to catch 60 Minutes tonight. Maybe you read the Sunday paper. It's likely you've done some reading online of your favorite blogs or news sites, and maybe you'll catch a cable news show or The Daily Show or Colbert sometime this week. How much does the media matter? More than just seeding conversations and tracking politics, sports, and celebrities, how much does the media contribute, for good or ill, to actually causing or shaping the events that it covers? KPFK's own Maria Armoudian has just written her first book in which she asks that question and answers that in certain situations of life and death on a grand scale, the media indeed does matter. Kill the Messenger emerged from Maria's studies into the causes of genocide, war, peacemaking, democratization, and the protection of human rights and the environment while she was working on her Ph.D. at USC. Looking across conflicts and policy successes and failures, she found that media and media professionals were among key factors in determining political outcomes, including, as I said, matters of life and death. Kill the Messenger is written in 5 parts. It shows how the media contributed to rage and genocide in Rwanda, the Holocaust and the Bosnian War, to peace in Northern Ireland and the war in Burundi, to democratization and the protection of human rights in South Africa, Taiwan, Mexico, and Senegal, and how they aided both in the destruction and the rebuilding of democracy in Chile. In its final case study, Kill the Messenger explores the media's role in the fate of the world as journalists disentangle the issue of climate change for the public. And I'll just mention that the book's foreword was written by Tom Hayden. On Freeform, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, and provocative approaches to business, environment, health, science, politics, media, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. Maria Armoudian is a journalist, singer-songwriter, legislative consultant, whose articles have been syndicated by the New York Times and the LA Times Syndicate. She's written for Salon, Daily Variety, Billboard, The Progressive, Alternate, and Business Week, and I understand is doing a lot more writing for a lot more folks in the near future based on the reception to this book. Her first book is, as I said, Kill the Messenger, the media's role in the fate of the world. She's also, of course, the host of the Insiders, preceding this show every Sunday at noon on KPFK and kpfk.org.
Thank you, Terrence. I used your world that just won't work, that just might work.
God,
just might work
slip.
the other. I know. Well, it's quite possible. I said to somebody yesterday that there, that old saying about people get the government they deserve, and now there's this new discussion based on the woman who is on NPR on the media. I'm forgetting her name. Brooke Gladstone. She's recently kind of said, well, maybe we get the media we deserve. But, I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking, well, does that mean we're going to get the planet we deserve? And this is a very deep concern. And so I used a world that just might work in that context the other day. So I just wanted you to know that your phrasing is getting out there.
Good, yes. And some people, will see that and they'll say, why don't you say a world that works? And
You're like, we're getting there.
Yeah, but it's the subjunctive case. Nothing's for sure.
Right.
You've got a role to play in this is why I leave it open like that.
Right.
Absolutely.
We all have a role. And that's part of the argument I'm making is that it's really we all have a role in this.
Yeah. So I like listeners to get to know the people behind the work and the ideas. I'm not interviewing your book. I'm interviewing you. So briefly, and we're going to spend the first section. We're not going to get into the book in the first section. So briefly, tell us about your path to the work that you're doing today. And feel free to mention mentors, turning points, moments of decision.
Oh, geez. I should have known because I've listened to your show for so long that you were going to do this. I thought he's not going to do this with me. He knows who I am. But you are.
They don't. Even if they hear your show, they don't.
Right. That's true. Well, gosh, I wouldn't even know where to start, Terrence. I was born a poor Armenian child.
In Oklahoma, right?
Well, in Louisiana.
Okay.
But yes, I grew up in Oklahoma. Very small town. Very sort of one-dimensional, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant for the most part. My parents were immigrants. They came from Cyprus and Lebanon, respectively. They are children of genocide survivors. And so they grew up kind of, I hate to use the word refugee, but sort of almost refugee-like, very poor, stuff that we hardly can imagine here, except for when we go down and look at the homeless populations. But so my parents both, especially my dad, had that kind of life as he was growing up.
And yet they're both
professors. And it's a funny story. Since you asked about me, I think it's better that I tell a story about my dad, because his story is probably the most remarkable, more remarkable than mine. So my grandfather, his dad, was about 10, 11, 12 when the Armenian genocide happened. And he lost 8 brothers and sisters and watched them die.
Let me just, for listeners, he was 10 or 11.
10, 11, 12, somewhere in there.
So that age lost all those siblings.
Yeah, all of his younger brothers and sisters, except for the baby, survived. So it was died. The youngest one survived. So there were 8 of them altogether that died in the genocide, mostly from the death marches, because they couldn't survive it. He made it and went first to Syria and ended up going to Lebanon. And because he was, removed from everything and they lost everything, he really didn't have a skill, didn't have an education. He was a little kid. And he learned to become a tailor and went to Lebanon and worked for the French army. At that time, the French were, in Lebanon. And when they moved out, became very, very, very poor. So he wanted to train my dad to be a tailor because that's what he knew. And my dad was about to go to middle school. And so he was going to pull him out of school and teach him the trade because that's what you do. You learn
You want to survive.
Right. Well, the principal from the middle school knocked on their door because they didn't have phones. And he said, you can't pull him out of school. He just is too talented with math and science. You've got to leave him in school. And you know what? We'll pay for it. And so my grandfather scratched his head. He said, why would anybody want an education? I don't understand. He needs a trade. So he, I think if my dad listens to this, he's going to kill me. But I just think it's such a great story. So he let him finish middle school. The same thing happened. He was going to pull him out after middle school. And the principal from the high school came over and did the same thing. He said, you cannot pull this kid out of school. He just math and science whiz. We'll pay for it. So they let him finish high school. Well, out of almost nowhere, he got this gigantic scholarship called the Rockefeller Scholarship to go to the AUB, the American University of Beirut, to study math and physics. And it was enough money to pay for his school and to send money home.
Wow.
So he became a physicist. I mean, what would you do if they were paying you to become a physicist? And then he came to the United States for grad school. My parents came together. They met there at AUB. And so I am the product of a couple of professors that immigrated over here to teach.
Wow.
I wanted to teach.
So you skirted the idea of the question about your path by telling us about your father's.
But that's not important.
But it is important, and the fact that it came out means how important it is to you. But a little more about your path, because you did not graduate from college and show up writing this book or being on the radio.
Right. No, I came to the United States. I was in the United States. I came to Los Angeles because I was a musician. And I thought I was going to make music. I came to Los Angeles. I ended up not doing that for a whole variety of reasons, which, listeners don't need to know. But I started writing for the music magazines and became a rock critic and was not political at all. Really, growing up in Weatherford, Oklahoma, you're pretty isolated from really hearing political issues and understanding them at any depth or breadth at all. So I one day interviewed, if she's listening, it'd be great if she's listening, this woman named Gretchen, who was the lead singer of a band called Mary's Danish. And on the back of the CD, they were giving proceeds away to 3 nonprofit organizations: Greenpeace, Amnesty International, and People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And this was in roughly 92, maybe?
Okay.
It was in the early 90s. And so I asked her, what are these organizations? And when she started telling me what was going on in the world, I was so upset. And you're laughing at me, Terrence.
Well, it's just wonderful. This young, ambitious musician rock critic is asking, what does Greenpeace do?
Suddenly learning from a singer of a rock band, what's going on in the world. And I was just aghast. I thought to myself, oh my God, this can't happen on my planet. And so that was kind of the moment that politicized me and opened my eyes, and they started to look for information, and I started to scour. I mean, at the time there was no internet, so it was scouring the airwaves, and it was listening to stations like this and asking people questions and going to conferences and things like that to try to understand what was happening. So
now it's interesting though. You ended up transitioning into working in government.
I did.
How did that happen, and what did you do in government? And here's my big question: what did you take from working in government?
Oh, so much. You know, that was such an education. So I ended up working in government. It was sort of this combination of things. I was writing for a bunch of magazines and newspapers, and there were two people that went to work or were affiliated in some way with this new committee. It wasn't really that new, but it was new that it was going to do something called the Joint Legislative Audit Committee. And they needed researchers. And so these two friends of mine at the time asked me if I wanted to work part-time doing research and writing. And I was like, sure, that sounds really interesting. Well, it ended up there were these gigantic investigations at the time. The committee was the Joint Legislative Audit Committee. It was chaired by this guy, Scott Wildman, who actually wanted to do something with it, whereas it had been kind of not really that active before. Well, the first kind of big investigation was the Belmont Learning Complex. And I don't know if people remember what that was. It was like a $250 million school, but it wasn't really even just a school. It was this effort to, wed a school with a retail and housing and put them all together on this lot that was also a shallow oil field. And they hadn't properly mitigated it. And it was just kind of from beginning to end full of problems, including this. There was hydrogen sulfide on the site, and there was methane on the site, and they were exposing these kids. Well, that led to my colleagues and I finding that the school districts were not really properly cleaning a lot of these sites. And they were getting cheap sites because they're a school district, and they don't want to spend a lot of money, but they were places where they used to chrome plate airplanes, for example. Chrome 6 happens to be a carcinogen, and kids are going to roll around in that dirt and get stuff all over their bodies.
Right. And kids are usually, especially during their growth periods, much more vulnerable.
Susceptible, right.
And levels of even things that are judged to be carcinogens, never mind the ones that, we're not sure about. Usually that research is done on adults, and during certain moments of development, children can be particularly vulnerable, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was that one, and then there were several other investigations. One had to do with MTB in the groundwater, and one had to do with the city of Hawaiian Gardens and what a mess it was. And you're looking at me very funny.
No, I'm just saying. So you're finding out all this mess is going on, and then you segued into actually working for. Yeah.
So I ended up leading the research at this committee for quite a while. And then the chair termed out, didn't win a Senate seat. He had run for Senate. He didn't win that. So I went to work for the Senate Majority Leader and then another senator, and I just worked on legislation from somewhat from what I was learning, but from other things as well. Environmental protection, government oversight, some civil rights. Corporate reform was a biggie that for me. I really wanted to do corporate reform. Very hard to get that passed.
Yeah.
So your big question, which is an important one.
What did you take from that time? And this was a period starting with the committee through the last time you were working for a legislator was 8 years, something like that?
2005.
So, I mean, how long did you work in government?
Yeah, 8 years.
8 years.
8 years. So, okay. So I think there's several things to take away. One is that most people in government want to do the right thing. And but when you put a whole bunch of people into any situation, you end up with a lot of sociological, psychological issues that make it harder and harder to actually be effective. And I don't think it's just a government thing. I think it's any time you put a lot of people into an organization, you end up with some situations that are very difficult to move something forward, as you and I know from being here at KPFK. Put a bunch of people in the room that don't all agree on something, and it can get kind of messed up. But in the legislative process, I think there's a whole nother thing. So there's the actual bureaucratic process, which I think has a lot of good people, but they get beaten up and they end up not wanting to do as much as they might have wanted. But the legislative process, boy, it is really hard to change anything. That's the first takeaway. during the process, all of these various groups, some of them are public interest groups, some of them are private interest groups, some of them are regular citizens, are all trying to affect this process. Well, legislators have several things that they are considering. One is, really, they do want to do things that they believe in.
Okay.
The other is they want to get reelected. And so they need to, A, satisfy their constituents, but B, be able to run again for office. So I remember, for example, I was working for, at the time, Richard Polanco, Senator Polanco. He was the majority leader. He was termed out and was going to run for something else. But the prison guards union could not stand the idea of him winning anything and wanted revenge because he had been exposing the abuses in the prisons. And they had already...
So here, what I hear is two of their agendas in conflict. The agenda to do the right thing and the agenda to get reelected.
Now, he never really let them push him around. He was exposing this stuff left and right. He created a select committee on the California prison system. And he, in the end, could never run for office again at the time because they just hammered him so much in a way that affected him personally.
No kidding. So it wasn't that he couldn't raise the funds, and it wasn't that he could.
It affected his personal life.
He couldn't get. He just wanted out.
He had to get out. So
success for them.
Success for them in that way. And God, I hope he's not going to kill me for talking about that on the air. But it just shows the power of certain organizations. Now, there were also district attorneys that they went after because the district attorneys were trying to prosecute the prison guards that were really...
Oh, so you're saying the correctional union went after some DAs.
Right, because they didn't want their members prosecuted. But these were kind of some pretty serious human rights abuses. The DAs had gone after them, and I think I remember one specific DA that ended up not being able to win office again because they poured so much money into beating him.
Right.
So that's another thing. It's very hard for people who are elected to continue if it offends a particular group that's powerful.
Yeah.
They won't be able to keep doing any good work if they're good.
And for people, you may know this, but in California, the correctional unions usually rank in the top 2, 3, 4.
It may be changing now, but yeah.
Among funders of at least statewide political office. And what I hear happening is a vicious circle. In other words, you become a powerful interest group. You influence who runs, what they're willing to do, how much they're willing to stick their neck out, whether they run again, and so on. And so your folks get more powerful. Your opponents maybe drop out or get less powerful. You get more. And so the teachers union, the correctional union, the Indian tribes, and the parties, I think, just there's this thing that it builds success, right. And whether that is success for the state of California and its people is open to question.
I wanted to tell you one other thing, one other experience working in the legislature, which is, one of my big issues was corporate reform, because when I looked at it, I said, if you look at all of the damage that's getting done, if you look at one big chunk of it, it's because of corporate behavior. So when you look deeply into why corporations behave the way they do, you can find the answer in the law itself. So I wanted to change the law. It wasn't that big of a change. What I found was that the California Chamber of Commerce, the Manufacturers Association, the Plastics Association, the Bankers Association were so able to kill legislation at every committee level. And if they couldn't kill it on the committee level, they could usually kill it on the governor's level. So it's the finding, I think the takeaway from this is legislation is a messy process. It's very hard to make any kind of big change. And which is why I ended up going, by the way, back to grad school, was so that I could step back and study this more like a science and try to understand why change was so hard. And that was one of the pieces that I was going to bring into. The media was the other piece, was one of the other pieces.
Sure.
There are still more pieces, and there are more books to come out.
Okay, so thank you for that. And then that leads you to go back to school to get a Ph.D. and just again, what did you think? I'm going to study this so I can do this.
Right. So I went into the Ph.D. program looking at this
In political science?
In political science and international relations, wanting to look at it as a systems theory. So to look at the various systems and the interactions of them. So, the public, the institutions, the electoral process, the media, and where they interacted and how they affected each other, and then what the outcome was. So I had this particular idea, and I realized I was going to have to break it down. And so I started out doing the institutions, didn't write a book about it, and then looked at the media piece as a separate piece. And this book, by the way, came out of a grad school paper.
That's what I was figuring.
Yeah.
Was it actually your PhD thesis?
No. But although my PhD thesis is about the same thing, it's about war and peace and media's role in war and peace. But this was actually what had happened was, I was in a seminar that I wanted to challenge the scholars who argued that media did not have effects, that they were other things, and that people, their argument, and they have a valid point. Their argument is, no, look, people incorporate media messages into what they already know, and they reject what they don't believe, and they accept what fits with their experience.
So, in other words, their basic thing, with some exceptions, would be to say the media reinforces cultural, social predispositions.
The idea is that people can reject media messages. And I think that is partly true, but it depends on the circumstances whether or not people really reject them. Now, and when we do talk about that book, we'll talk about this, but even in situations where the media were completely taken over, like in Rwanda or in the Holocaust, there were dissenters. There were people who rejected the message about the other side and tried to organize to change things. But, it's very hard in those circumstances because there are a lot of people that are susceptible to hearing a message over and over and over again. So, okay, so what I wanted to do was argue with those scholars in a paper that media did have effects, and when did they have effects, and how did they affect people? So I wrote this paper. I scoured the literature, the peer-reviewed literature, to see what was already out there, and then I added pieces to it to kind of pull it all together. And that was essentially what turned into this book. So I turned in the paper, and yes, you've got your eyes open. So.
Well, I was going to say, it sounds like you had basically the first half of your book proposal. The second half, of course, as people may know, is why do people want this book? Is there a market for this book? What else is out there, and all that sort of thing. But it sounds like your paper was at least your.
It was
this
the
is
starting
what the book
point.
will be about.
It was definitely a starting point, and it's funny. The book did develop in a little bit of a different direction than I thought it would. I found out some new things, so that was it was a complete surprise in many cases.
Let me switch again. We'll come back to the book, but what did you take from your time in academia?
In terms of, I will tell you, it's for the most part, it was an extraordinary experience.
Extraordinarily positive.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Well, you're immersed in this search for knowledge, and you're immersed in this conversation about what is the truth. And you find that there are all of these different perspectives and competing ideas about what's really going on politically, and all these different ways of getting at what's really going on. And it opens you up to seeing things in all these different ways.
Let me ask you two questions about that. The first one is personal, which is, do you think that was more empowering for you because you didn't go straight from the time you graduated?
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm not going to ask your age, but you had
old.
You'd been out of school in at least a couple of careers by then before you went back in.
Absolutely.
You think that made a big difference?
This was like my fourth or fifth career. Absolutely. Yeah, you should go now. You'd be a great scholar.
I've thought about
I'm liking this.
I've thought about it.
I like this. Dr. McNally.
I have some
Professor
ideas.
McNally.
We can talk about it. Okay, and the other one is, what about what appears to me to be the biggest downfall of academia, and you've just been in it more recently than I, which is the silos, the separation. Here you say you were going to study the systems, the interdependent, interrelated, dynamic behavior of systems. Academia does so much to say, this is this school, this is this school, this is this topic, I'm an expert on this.
Yeah, well, I think the bigger problem with academia is communicating with the public. And you probably know when you're driving in, when you hear that segment I do, the Scholar Circle, that I'm trying to bridge that a little bit. But I think that's the biggest problem is communicating with the public, because they get so esoteric.
Yes.
That they can't necessarily translate it.
Right.
But they do, actually. It's just...
No, I certainly agree. But you don't think that the fact that academia has this tradition of things are separate, when in fact we know reality is that things are not separate?
Well, not all of them do
problem?
that. So, I mean, there are people that specialize in very little, narrow fields. But there are also people that...
What I will take is, if you're saying that you went in hoping to be able to look at systems, and your time in the university did not keep you from doing that you were able to find the teachers, the allies, and so on, the programs and so on that allowed you to do that. That's encouraging.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I put myself into a category now called the constructionists. And the constructionists... The opposite
of the deconstructionists?
Well, no, not exactly. You can still deconstruct within a constructionist paradigm.
Go ahead. And this is how academics talk. Go ahead.
Well, the idea of the constructionist is that reality is constructed by a multiple set of factors. And that's actually what I did with this book. It's a constructionist book. And media are a very important component of that construction, because it affects how people understand political realities, and their behavior tends to follow what they believe to be the case. And but so the constructionists look at it all. You look at leadership. I'm going to do the political construction. You look at leaders' roles. You look at the role of culture. You look at the role of social psychology. You look at the role of the individual, and then how those things flow together. So I would say it just depends on what paradigm you end up throwing yourself into, and I ended up in a constructionist paradigm.
Okay.
Like saying paradigm.
Academics love that. The next question I want to ask is, what brought you to radio, and how has your show evolved over the years?
Oh, my goodness.
How long have you been doing it now?
Well, you remember I was a journalist before.
That's right.
I was
before you went into government, you were a journalist.
I was a journalist, and I also was involved in a syndicated radio show, but it was a music show. It was one of these countdown shows, like a Casey Kasem countdown show, and I was the one who wrote the dialogue for these hosts for this, I think it was called the World Chart at the time. And the guy who hired me, dear friend of mine who's just passed away, very sad. But, so I had been involved in radio and other production elements. And then I went into government, but I continued to do a little bit of journalism here and there. And then came back because of KPFK. KPFK had a pretty important effect on me. First, in terms of my understanding of things, but then also giving me an alternative understanding. But also, one of the investigations we did was of the Pacifica breakdown in 1999 that ended up in the lockout. And Terrence doesn't like this at all. But in essence, there was a lockout at KPFA where they locked everybody out.
KPFA in Berkeley, as they did at BAI in New York.
And we didn't investigate Pacifica per se. Because we were a government oversight agency, we investigated the government breakdowns. Like, what about the Attorney General's role in this? What about the Secretary of State's role in this?
Because they were a nonprofit?
Right. And a California nonprofit.
Okay.
But put out a little report and voila. So that tied me back into this, and, here we are today.
So how has your show evolved?
Oh, my gosh.
How many years have you been doing it?
8 or 9 or something like that. I
Okay.
know. Can you believe that? Well, I started out doing mostly because I thought I had a specialty, which was state politics. I had worked in state politics for a long time. So I thought that was my specialty. I offer people an insider's view a little bit about state politics and bring in people that worked on state issues. And I wasn't really on the air very much. But then as I went into grad school, I just thought, well, I can also bridge all this other material, hopefully, and bring this to them. So I expanded it a little bit. I still do some state political things, but then, I don't know if you know, our show's like in 15 cities now.
Right.
So we have, can't really focus on California so
Sacramento
much.
is not the center of the world
anymore. It's
anymore.
not, except for sometimes it is. Like,
Yeah.
In the case of the climate change legislation, that is the center of the world.
Right.
So.
Yeah. No, I had Terry, I recently did an interview that'll air soon with Terry Tamminen about the role that California plays in the world. Not just the country, but the world in terms of climate change. He's a great
guest, by the way. It's been many years since I've had him on, but he's great. And then, of course, I started this segment, this half hour called the Scholar Circle, where we have 3 scholars, breaking down an issue. Today we did Congress. Last week we did political violence because of the Norway killings. So.
Right. Well, let me ask you this. How do you balance?
I don't.
The expertise of your guests and the complexity of the issues you confront with the demand that radio hold listeners' attention, that need to sound crisp and bitey and have energy to make issues simple enough that everyone understands, and even perhaps to entertain?
Boy, I don't think I do a very good job of entertaining. But I don't know. It's a good question.
Because it's interesting given your mixed background.
Right. Yeah, I guess you're right with the entertainment thing in the background, but
so what do you?
Although it's a different entertainment than like what you did.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
I mean, you did much more fun things than I did.
I acted and wrote movies and produced records,
and I mean, you have this
music videos.
Amazing past. So,
but how do you?
I want to talk about you.
Have me on your show.
Okay, it's a deal.
Wait,
how do we do one together for 2 hours?
Well,
that would be fun.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, sorry, you wanted to ask questions.
How do you think about that? How do you wrestle with that? What do you say to your scholars before you put them on the air?
I say we'll edit you, so if you say anything, too esoteric, we'll cut it out. No, I don't actually say it like that, but, mostly we do edit. We don't do very much live anymore because of that.
I wondered.
Yeah, we cut a lot of the things out that people
who just aren't used to doing radio.
Right.
Because, in other words, a lot of these experts you're finding in academia, some academics are great on radio. I mean, there's no question. And some, it's just not their. Yeah. So I wondered why you pre-recorded so much. That's one of the reasons.
That's one of the reasons. The other is because we air in other cities on Fridays and Saturdays.
Oh. And rather than be a week late.
Right.
Better to be a couple of days late here.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. What is your hope that people get out of listening to your radio show?
It's actually the same hope as I have with this book, which is if people really engage in the big questions of what's occurring and how we all fit into it and how we all affect it, that we can, to use your phrase, create a world that just might work. But it takes serious engagement because we're all in this together. And everything everybody does has an impact. And sometimes it's a small impact, but sometimes it's a big impact. And, one guy in Norway picks up a gun and kills 70 people. And that's a huge impact. One person might have been able to stop that. That would have been a huge impact.
I'm going to tell you actually an example that I've used before on the show. It comes from Paul Loeb. I don't know if you know Paul. He wrote Soul of a Citizen. But he told this one anecdote that is so great. A woman joined another small group to protest nuclear weapons. And she went to Washington, and she demonstrated in front of the White House. She said it was a rainy day. There were about 12 people. She felt like it was meaningless, useless, and so on. Years later, she hears Benjamin Spock speak, the famous pediatrician, best-selling author who became one of the leaders of the SANE movement. I always get moved when I tell this story. Someone asked him why he got involved, and he said one day he was driving past the White House.
And he saw her.
And he saw 12 people demonstrating in the rain. And he went, there's something to this.
Wow.
So, excuse me. But to me, that is just a great demonstration of it's up to each of us.
Yeah.
Let me ask one last. I said that would be the last. This one isn't about that. Where do you get your media? What do you respect? What do you listen to? What gives you the most juice?
Boy, I try to read as much as I can from both mainstream and alternative. And then I also try to scour the academic literature because that is peer-reviewed. And it's much different kind of reading, and it's much smaller framework. In other words, they're looking usually at a tiny piece of the puzzle, and then I try to see how that tiny piece of the puzzle fits into the larger piece. But I read everything from, first of all, I don't watch TV other than some Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert. I should. I don't. You just have to figure out what you can watch. But there's very little on there that I have found that is that helpful. If I had cable, I'd probably watch C-SPAN, but I don't want to pay for cable just for C-SPAN. But everything from, there's a handful of programs on this airwaves, including yours, that I love very much, all the way through, reading the New York Times, because you have to read the New York Times. I mean, I just don't think you can go without seeing that and seeing what those arguments are.
What international stuff do you read?
Boy, I don't know that I have one specific one that I go to.
Oh, okay.
But
that is one of the great gifts of the internet.
Oh my God, it's
is
great.
That we can read The Guardian and we can read.
Oh, The Guardian is. The Guardian. All right, so let me just say that of all the media that I praise in this book, The Guardian gets the most praise.
That's The Guardian of London.
Yeah. And I'll tell you one of the reasons why they're so good. And I actually just sent the PDF of this book over to The Guardian to say, I'm not supposed to send this PDF out, but I want you guys to know that you've done something. They are not a for-profit style of journalism. They are a trust. And having been a trust, and the trust has to have a purpose, and that purpose is good journalism and liberal journalism. It's in there that it's liberal journalism. So when one of the things that drives an organization is its mission statement. And when its mission is about profit, then things are oriented towards that profit. But The Guardian has managed to be a kind of a beacon in a lot of these cases. They were a leader in the South Africa. They're a leader in climate change. And a leader in many ways on the climate change issue, by the way. One of their reporters was the only one that went and checked the truth of when all these naysayers were saying, oh, well, I published this article in Science magazine on such and such date. Well, he actually went and looked for it. Everybody else just believed him. And this particular journalist went, well, let me go look at that magazine. And it wasn't there. So there are things like this.
Were they the ones also that broke the hacking, the News Corp hacking?
About which aspect of
the
it?
The latest stuff.
Oh, yes.
That was The Guardian,
yeah.
So anybody who hasn't been reading The Guardian, check it out.
The Guardian is very good. One other thing I wanted to say about them on climate change, which is they organized a whole bunch of media together to sign on to a statement asking policymakers to take action on climate change. I don't remember how many newspapers it was, but it was across the world. And they wrote up this statement, and all of these newspapers signed on. And that was another very important piece.
Let me, again, this is about your book, but not specifically about your book. Something which I have been appalled by, and you mention in your book certainly, is the false fetish of balance.
Right.
The false it's not a fault. It is a fetish, but it is a false way to do journalism, which is that there are two sides to every story.
Right. I overheard, actually a friend of mine said this, Jeffrey Kay. He said, it's like saying there's a positive and negative to lynching, like there are two sides to lynching. There's also in here, I quoted somebody from FAIR, Julie Haller, who said, that's like saying, let's do the positive and negative side of gravity.
Exactly.
So it's right there. You can't always do that.
And most mainstream, all that television you don't watch, they do it so like crazy, but so do most people. So do most people in journalism. And as you get into in your book, especially in the climate change portion at the end, not irreparable, but enormous damage.
Right.
To the understanding.
Well, let's just so listeners understand what we're talking about on there. What essentially, what Terence is referring to is that, for many, many years, the media were kind of the bridge between scientists and the public. That's where the public got their information about science. And they did a pretty good job. But then when the industry, the fossil fuel industry, organized to try to counter any kind of positive policy towards mitigating climate change, they started putting out these so-called experts who at one point may have been academics that studied the issue but hadn't been doing research scientists for a long time.
But they went where the money was.
And they were just essentially saying, oh, no, that's not true, to everything the science was producing. Now, the way academic science is done is that it is blindly read by other members of the scientific community, so that, like, if you wrote a piece and you had this research and you showed it to me and I had to look over all of your math and your science and your data and I were a scientist, I wouldn't know that you wrote it.
Wouldn't know what institution I was at?
Nothing.
So, so it comes to you as, here is an article, you evaluate it. Who does this peer review?
Yeah, well, it's the other scientists, and
everyone volunteers. This is something you do for free as part of being part of the community,
right? And before
your stuff will be peer reviewed, and you volunteer to review others,
right? And before it can get published in what they call a refereed journal, a peer reviewed journal, it has to be vetted by a certain number of, and it's different for each field. Like, I think our field, it's like 3, 4, 5, 6 people have to vet it and go, yeah, those numbers add up. Those numbers make sense. That is based on a premise that is established. Well, so then you've got these fossil fuel industry putting these people that every time this climate research was turning up, peer reviewed, checked, double checked, the fossil fuel industry would have somebody say, oh, that's not true. Oh, that's not true. Well, scientists are not fighters. They're used to being circumspect, and they're used to saying, oh, well, we're open to hearing the other side.
It is part of science to be skeptical.
Yeah.
It is. The idea is you don't have the truth, and you went into science. Science is about the search. Right. It's not about the conclusion. I've had Chris Mooney on this show a number of times.
Yeah, I used his book a little bit as some background. Yeah, he's very good.
You, in this book, as I said, you set up a premise, kind of. Let's look at whether the media really does have an effect for good or ill. And then you go through a number of cases. And let me see, just Nazi Germany, Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis, the former Yugoslavia, the
Bosnian War,
Northern Ireland, where now in all of those,
the first 3, right,
the media was essentially a force for bad.
What happened in those 3 cases, Bosnia, the Holocaust, and the Bosnian War, the Holocaust, and the Rwandan genocide, is that you had bad actors taking over the media, extremists taking over the media, and putting messages out that would encourage people to kill people that they'd normally would care about.
Right. And they took over the media not because they wanted to become media magnates, but because they already had this agenda, and they, without having read your book, knew that the media was the way to do it.
I would say that's probably the case. I mean, I wasn't in their heads.
No.
Right. I would guess that's right.
The taking over the media was part of an agenda, right? And that agenda was already in. Now, what was that agenda? Was the agenda in those 3 cases, was it genocide, or was it domination and genocide was part of it, or something? I mean,
I think in Rwanda and the Holocaust genocide was definitely a big piece of what they wanted. In the Bosnian War, for example, I'll use the Serbian media takeover. When the Serbs took over all the media and started generating these messages, I think it was more about taking all that territory and not, and getting rid of who was on it. So
in other words, you've got someone who says in that case, Yugoslavia is newly
breaking
free,
up. Yeah.
And so now turmoil that's been held under wraps by a strongman is now released, right?
There was, I would say, under the strongman. You're talking about Tito.
Yeah.
I would say under the strongman, the people, there was a brotherhood and unity. That was.
I mean, that's what I read in your book. And I mean, it's interesting because
you told me you hadn't read the book.
No, I didn't. No. I said you hadn't gotten me the book. I've read the book.
Okay, good.
I read the PDF. And it reminded me of Saddam Hussein. Strong man, sometimes in these tribal.
I would say no. Tito was no Saddam Hussein.
But there things. sectarian or tribal violence was held down by a strongman.
The tribal violence all but disappeared. People were intermarried. People were working together. People were beginning to identify not as a Serb or a Croat or a Bosnian. They were identifying as a Yugoslavian.
Once they took over, and by the way, Maria said they took over the media. In the case of these three cases, which is Bosnia, Rwanda, and Nazi Germany, they really took over the media. They didn't just dominate it; they took it over.
Now, in Bosnia, they didn't completely get it all. There were some really interesting efforts by journalists.
But it was, what did you say? 8 out of 10
transmitters,
television transmitters,
television
in the station.
And radio.
They violently and actively took those over.
Or they blew them up.
And Nazi Germany did the same thing. Outlawed they blew up
opposing
in Bosnia. They
and killed the journalists.
Right.
Yeah, there was a war on journalism.
So in those cases, it wasn't just that someone had a good angle and began to dominate metaphorically. In those three cases, this was strategic and this was done violently.
And very much so. And yet you had a handful of journalists in Bosnia specifically that continued to put out their newspapers and continued to report the news. And a lot of it was really important things for people who are in hiding and running away from war. Like, look, we found a new water spring. There's water, for example.
Right.
And, but yet they were attacked. One was called Oslobodenia. I don't know if I'm saying this quite correctly, but the editor of that place, who's now in the United States, but they were shelled every other week, and they were machine gunned, and their building was set on fire, and they kept putting out the paper. So there were great journalists throughout this book that just kept trying to do their job.
Well, let's shift now. Those aren't the so those are three where media was used to do wrong,
to foment violence.
Now, in other cases, Northern Ireland, South Africa, Senegal, and you've seen
Chile
the opposite.
Too, in some ways,
Chile,
Mexico,
you say
Taiwan.
Chile went both ways. The media helped it
get
dark, and the media helped it get light.
Specific members of the media made it go dark in Chile. There was a media magnate there, who I believe is still there, who had a small media empire, including kind of the paper of record called El Mercurio. And he was one of the people that encouraged President Nixon to come in and enact the coup violently. He came and he met with Nixon, and what had happened was Salvador Allende, was planning to nationalize the newsprint. And he was very upset about this. So he organized quite a bit. Now, the CIA put his newspaper on the payroll
of the CIA.
Yeah. So El Mercurio then was churning out all of this rumor and falsehood about Allende and all these awful juxtapositions. You'd put Allende's photo next to these dead animals and have by some implication. And some awful things to foment hate against those groups that supported Allende and also Allende. So that was the media's role in the downfall of Chile. Chile being one of the longest, if not the longest, standing democracy in South America. I mean, it was
at the time.
Yeah, and it was a culture where people were so courteous to each other and so respectful to each other. And now, with the media being polarized, people started screaming at each other, and everything broke into a fight, and they were blaming each other because one side was blaming the other side, and it was just very ugly. But then, yes, gradually some underground media grew, and they
So very briefly, because I want to reflect in the last couple of minutes on the U.S., the positive in South Africa and the positive in Senegal.
Right. Well, they're very different. So it'd be hard to throw them in together.
Yeah.
South Africa, long apartheid, as most of our listeners know, very divided media again, but most of the Afrikaans language media always portrayed the black South Africans in a particular way. They're terrorists, we have the right to a white South Africa. There are all of these kind of framing. There was an underground media that was exposing all of the abuse against the black Africans, and some of the English language media followed suit. The South African government really clobbered those journalists. One of them, who was also a human rights lawyer, I mean, they killed a couple of them, letter bombs, car bombs, even while they were in exile. But through their media, they reached international media, and the international media reached the international leaders, and the international leaders put pressure onto South Africa in such a way that the transformation was possible. So it's this kind of marriage that you see when you want a transformation. The marriage is always, it's individual people, it's a media, even the smallest media. It's kind of like your people you're talking about.
Yeah.
That communicate to other people, and it grows, and it's leadership that come together to create any kind of a transformation. And
by the way, a book that I will also recommend is A Force More Powerful. Do you know that book?
I do not.
Oh, it's a great book. It also was a PBS series of documentaries, but the book is out there. It basically, the premise is that while we think of the 20th century as the most violent, destructive, blah blah, nuclear weapons, Holocaust, etc., that because the spread of media meant that civil disobedience could really work, and it is about 30 case studies of civil disobedience in the 20th century, and all of them, for their power, depend on the media.
Yeah,
whether it's when the shots of dogs on civil rights folks in Alabama, or Gandhi on radio. It takes this. This goes to your thing about the different factors. Civil disobedience wouldn't work nearly as well without communication.
Can I say one last thing?
No, because it's 56, and I need you to say something about the U.S. As I read about the blame frames, the glorification of the patriotic victim, the labeling of opponents as not real Germans or real Rwandans, I can't help but think of America. You got 1 minute.
Well, I think American media has become more and more polarized. There was a time when it was considered to be good journalism to be very neutral. And even though it's, neutrality is a contested concept as well, but more and more we are hearing a very emotional message. We're seeing a lot of framework that almost resembles some of these very ugly situations.
You're not real Americans.
Not a real American. Blame the problem onto a certain specific group of people. And who didn't necessarily create the problem. They have contributed to it, but didn't create the problem. And therefore, we must do X, and that X is usually something that's not very positive. I have to say this one last thing. I think the most important piece to take away from this is that the world is fluid, and it is ever-changing, and that as we communicate through these, every piece of communication leads in one direction or another, and that is how we create the world that just might work.
Okay, the book is Kill the Messenger, the Media's Role in the Fate of the World. The website is armoudian.com.